So I'm Ruth Blomquist, and I am a soil health specialist with NRCS. And before I get started, I kind of want to get a feel for who is in the audience today. So who do we have here that would be a farmer today? Okay, so out of you, I'm going to be talking about the economics of soil health. So I want to get a feel for the adoption of soil health practices. So how many people, by a show of hands, would consider yourselves to be primarily no-till or conservation tillage? Okay, a pretty good number. How many people have used cover crops for, let's say, more than 10 years? Do we have anyone at that more than 10 years? We got a few. Okay, how many people are at that 5 to 10 year window with cover crop use? Okay, who's tried cover crops? Okay, a few more people. So I'm going to get into the economics and how we make these systems profitable. And this is important to me personally. I farm with my husband and father-in-law in western Guthrie County. And over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, we've started adopting more of these practices as well on our own operation. So we used to be, I would say, maybe more conservation tillage, but we've switched to no-till primarily, with the exception of the ruts that we have to fix this spring. But we had to invest in downforce on our planter to make that successful. And we've always done a few acres of cover crop, but I think last fall we got about 90% of our acres seeded to cover crop. And we did have to invest in an air seeder to make that possible. We just couldn't cover enough acres with that 10-foot drill. So we've made some pretty significant investments into these soil health systems. And then every year we're also making that investment in cover crop seed, right? And that can vary in cost depending on what species you're planting. It can get a little pricey, especially if you're using those diverse mixes, but there's a cost associated with it. So that leads to the big question, right? Do cover crops pay, or does soil health pay? I'm going to give you the answer right away at the beginning of the presentation, so I can quit here and probably hand it off, right? But that answer is yes, soil health systems do pay. And we'll get into some more specifics about how they can pay over time. But I wanted to do a quick review on soil health. And when we think about soil health, we think about it as the continued capacity of the soil to function. So I always think, I want to farm for at least 30 more years. And if my kids want to come home and farm, I want them to be able to farm. And I want it to be a productive soil resource, right? I don't want to hand them something that's degraded. I want it to continue to be productive. So that's what we talk about when we talk about soil health. And we talk about functions of the soil. I think the big one that everybody thinks about, right? We need the soil to grow plants. We also need the soil to kind of capture and infiltrate water and store water, cycle and recycle nutrients, really be resilient to some of the stresses that we face with droughts or floods, things like pests and pathogens, and other functions that we need the soil to perform in order to grow plants. But often cases what we see is that the soil isn't functioning like it should. So we see that it can't take water in, and then we have symptoms like erosion, and we also are a lot more susceptible to some of those drought stresses, and we don't have good soil structure, so the soil isn't functioning as it should. And so that's where we talk about these soil health principles, and the role of the soil health principles is that they work to restore our soil function. And they're all about how we can work with the soil biology to restore that soil function. Okay, so we've gotten to a basic understanding of soil health, and we want to implement some of these practices. So we might start implementing no-till and add cover crops so that we can rebuild and regenerate our soil. And as we do that, we see that our soil starts to function properly, and we build our organic matter. We can build our soil structure. We have better water holding capacity. We're building more and more organic matter. But ultimately, this is our goal, right? Our crop yields go up, our input costs can go down, and we lower our risk. And that's where that profitability piece comes in, right? How can we do that? How can we make our crop yields increase, lower our costs, and lower our risk? So we are able to do this really successfully. There was a really nice study that came out recently from Soil Health Institute about 1.5 years ago, and they surveyed 100 farmers across 9 states and found that 85% of growers reported that this system was profitable for them, so their net income increased. And they were able to do that by 67% reported that they increased their yields. And then they also reported an average of $24 an acre decrease in costs. But I want to point out one really important piece of this study. If you look into the data, these were not going to be your first year cover croppers. These were some of our early adopters or experts or high level managers. So they had been doing no-till for an average of 19 years, and they'd been using cover crops for an average of 9 years. So they'd had some time and some experience, and they'd built up their soil to where it was performing and functioning. Okay? So kind of keep that in mind as we talk about some of these things as well. So we're going to look at some of those specific pieces here, and starting with reducing weeds. And Megan already covered this very nicely on how cover crops in combination with your herbicide can be really effective at reducing weed pressure. And if we do that over time, if you think about reducing the overall weed seed bank, and you can have less weed pressure, there is the potential to reduce some herbicides. Oops. So there was a study done, this was a few years ago by James Horman, and he found that long-term no-tillers reported if they used cover crops could reduce their herbicides by about 33%. So I think the key here again is kind of that if we use cover crops over time and we've successfully reduced that weed seed bank, we can see better weed control and get by with a little less herbicide. So I did just some quick math using the 2023 Iowa State cost of production estimates, and I looked at the soybeans, and their predicted cost for herbicide this year is $72.50 an acre, and so I just cut that by 33%. The potential there is to save about $24. So if you could save $24 right there, you've practically paid for your cover crop seed and application, right? So if you have the ability to do that, I think this one also, and I'm sure Megan touched on this as well, but just make sure that you're still scouting, you know what your weed pressure is, and that you're cautious about doing this as well. On our own farm last year, we actually were able to reduce some herbicide. We did not cut out a pass in our soybeans, but on our post-pass, we could reduce the chemical that we put in because we did have good control. We had appropriate biomass out there. We scouted it. We knew what weeds were there, and we felt comfortable doing that. We did not reduce by 33%, but we did start doing some reduction. So the more time that you're in these systems and you're comfortable with it, the more ability you have to really make those numbers work out and pay. Okay, and then I'm going to talk about kind of more the soil structure side, so the opportunity to reduce compaction and have better drainage in your soil. We know those living roots from our cover crops can really break up the compaction and build our soil structure, and that can help us manage that water and a little bit better. So our deep-rooted and fibrous cover crops, as they grow down through the soil, they're really good at breaking up some of that compaction, and we have all that extra benefit of having the living root in the soil. And I just did some quick math looking again at the Iowa State University custom rate surveys. So if we have to do deep ripping to break up our compaction, it'd be $23 an acre. And then you'd probably run over it with the field cultivator in the spring. So you could be at about $39 an acre for cost on that. So again, if we can reduce those, anytime you can reduce a tillage pass, right, you're going to save money on fuel and cost there. So this is just looking at some of the potential for what those numbers could look like. Now, you're probably not going to do deep ripping on all of your acres, so you would have to kind of figure that out, what that looked like on your farm as well. And then to address tiling, it can be a bit of a challenging subject, right? So a lot of times, our soils can be inherently poorly drained, and you're still going to need tile to drain that soil. However, sometimes they're not necessarily poorly drained, but what we're seeing is a symptom of poor function, and that water can't infiltrate down into the soil. So we need to treat the problem and build up our soil structure so that we can get better water infiltration. So in this case where we can use cover crops, and that is one of the first benefits that people will say if they use cover crops, usually within a year you can have better water infiltration. And you could potentially save some money with not having to tile if you can fix that infiltration issue, right? And getting that water down into the soil profile where your crop actually needs it is going to make a huge difference. So this is from 2 fields. This was actually from 2010, and it was a drought year. So So the field that was no-tilled had better soil structure. That water could get down into the profile where the crops could use it later in the year when it got dry. So that was 173 bushels to an acre versus 125. So immediately that pays, right? You saw a return there by building that resilient cropping system. Okay, we're going to look at the potential to reduce fertilizer. Has anyone in the audience been able to reduce any of their inputs? At least one. Okay. I think this one can be challenging too because it's a little scary. Is it scary, Randy?
Oh, yeah. You're wondering whether you're doing the right thing.
Right. So it can be really intimidating, but the potential to be able to do it is there. And one way that cover crops can make your nutrient program more efficient is just that we know that they're living and growing and taking up nutrients and holding them on the field. So they're just going to prevent those losses. And then after you terminate them, as they decompose, they're going to release that back to the crop as it's growing and they can take it up. So we're keeping our nutrients on the field and they'll be available for the crop as it's growing. So it makes it more efficient that way. But this other piece of this is as we build that soil system and we build the function back in and we have a diverse community of biology there, they're going to improve the nutrient cycling and what's available to your plants. And so they interact with the roots and the minerals, and the biology is very good at making those nutrients plant available. So when we have our systems that are functioning really well and we have the diverse biological communities, there's a lot of potential there to access soil nutrients that maybe we previously couldn't. And so I was just looking at some of numbers that I could find, and has anyone heard of Wayne Fredericks? He is definitely a soil health adopter. He's up by Osage, which is in northern Iowa. But he started no-tilling his soybeans in '91 and strip-tills his corn, started doing that in early 2000s, added cover crops in 2012 and has seen fantastic success in some of this. But he's been able to reduce his fertilizer use by about 30%. So I ran some quick numbers on this again. So you can see what I used. I used 0.8 as the nitrogen use efficiency rate, which most people will say around 1. But I think that a lot of times we could generally be around 0.8. But if we could reduce that by 30%, we'd be around 0.6. We could save about $30 an acre on your nitrogen program. If we do the same calculations on phosphorus, there's the potential there to save, $34. We could be around $47 to $50 an acre in savings, just if we could get our soil functioning to the point where we're more efficient with our nutrients. And I think that these numbers are actually pretty conservative. I didn't even include potassium in there, so if you really wanted to start including more, that dollar value could go up quite a bit. But I would say you would want to have been doing this for a while. You would want to know what's happening in your soil and definitely start slowly. Don't decide to cut your nitrogen program by 30% across the board if you've been cover cropping for a year. It will not work, okay? Do it cautiously, but it absolutely can work. And then I'll throw in the potential, if you can get some of those legume cover crops to be really well established, there is the potential to fix some more N. In this picture, I think that veg could fix, I think it was credited 150 pounds of nitrogen. So there is the potential to fix some of your own nitrogen. It's a little harder here sometimes to get that established. You have to let it grow. You have to have the biomass. We're going to look at soil erosion, and this was actually an Iowa Learning Farms PFI and Iowa State study, and try to just quantify and put some dollar values on erosion, okay? So they looked at the loss of value to your land through soil erosion and came up with a number of about 50 cents per ton for just the change to the value of your land. That's a hard one to quantify. I know that if I went to Walmart and asked to buy a ton of soil for 49 cents, I think that they would give me some funny looks, right? But it's hard to quantify that value. And then they also looked at just the cost of the nutrients that we're losing through that erosion, so your nitrogen and phosphorus that could be moving with that soil. And the cost of that was about $6 per ton. So if we just use the average value of 5 tons, you could have about $30 an acre from erosion. But we know that if we use no-till, it's a good start to stopping erosion. But when you add in cover crops, we can get that value to almost zero, right? So if we can get that so we have no erosion, then there's a potential savings there of just recouping that $30 in value. And increasing yield. So if you think about your fields right now, you can kind of divide them into these zones where you have your areas that are probably really high yielding all the time, no matter what. If you think about those areas, they might be some of your areas of highest organic matter. And we have our areas that are just going to yield nothing every year, no matter what. So, but we also have a large portion of that yield that can be kind of that unstable zone. So in our good weather years, it's going to be really high yielding. In our poor weather years, it's probably pretty low yielding. And so if we can build up our soils and increase our organic matter, that's where we find this increase in yield. So using Wayne Fredericks again, we found that over time he was able to really change the variability in his field. So it used to be high. As he got into these systems, he was able to make them more stable. He had a lot less yield variability. And that's another thing that a lot of these experienced cover crop growers report, is that their bottom end is coming up, so the yield on their lower performing pieces is coming up, and the variability within the field is shrinking. So your yield map is turning more yellow and green instead of those reds and oranges at the bottom. I just want to briefly throw in some other opportunities. And I think our panel is going to touch on this a lot more, so I'm not going to get into it. But if you can add livestock into this piece of the puzzle, then cover crops absolutely can pay on year one, right? Because you can capture a lot of value by adding livestock and having that as a feed source for grazing. And then I just wanted to throw out some other maybe unique opportunities that we can get creative when you think about how to make these systems profitable. So grow your own cover crop seed. Is anyone growing their own seed? Okay, a few people. You can sell that seed to your neighbors. I think some of these other systems that are picking up in popularity, things like double cropping or relay cropping, so you can take 2 crops off that acre, it's going to be more profitable and change those numbers. And then there's just some interesting other markets to look into, perennial crops, small grains. I know of one grower in Adams County who is selling his rye to a distillery, so he can get a premium price for that as well. I think carbon markets are coming back and increasing in popularity, so more opportunities to profit on that acre. And then even things, consumers are starting to demand some higher quality products. So now there's even a process called Regen Verified, where you might be able to get some premiums for growing crops using these soil health practices. So there are some unique and interesting opportunities out there if you want to pursue them. And just briefly wanted to there are a lot of people making these soil health systems very profitable nationally, locally, here in your county that are doing it. So it is possible. You have to be willing to make some changes. You have to be willing to take a few risks, but they are absolutely profitable over time. I just wanted to throw a few dollar values on there. I didn't include very many because I think that's going to change depending on your operation and how you're able to do things, but the possibility to make money is right there. And then just want you to think, as we are working, the main goal is to rebuild and regenerate your soil. And you can't really put a dollar value on it, but what is the value of your soil as you're doing that? So it's more of a philosophical question to leave you with today, is what is that value and how can we quantify that?